Hello. I just did a video on judging standards for test day, and I think it's a terrible video. I'm going to review it, but I'm likely not going to post it. But I'm going to do my video, which is likely going to refer to this other video, which I'm not going to post. I'm going to have to redo it. So that'll be confusing for people. I'm going to talk about test day standards and how I decide whether a test passes or fails. There's essentially two really simple graphs you have to keep into you have to integrate these two graphs. So this is passing standard. Again, I do things on a 1 to 10 ratio. So a 5 would be an average test, which should pass, or it's around 50-50. You know, you really want to be around, I want my kids to be around a 7 or 8, so they're tested clearly passable. But there are a few, as I said, two different graphs you have to keep in mind. One is judging standards. So I would say, I should really get different colors. I got to get a red marker. My last one died. This middle area here, between a 3 and a 7 for judging standards, I would say is the gray area. If you have a test in there, it could pass, could fail. Generally, if you go above 5, it's far more likely to pass. If you're around 7, you know, I generally try to keep my judging standards or test standards around a 7, and I have about a 90% pass rate, 100% pass rate over the last 4 years. But in Labrador, I was around, because of the not enough ice time, not enough lesson time, I crept down to about 84, 83% a couple of years. If you're down around a 3 as a coach, putting in tests that really shouldn't pass most of the time, which, believe it or not, many coaches do, to try to get their kids up to different levels and make it appear that they're progressing faster than they actually are, either because they don't know or because they're just they have pushy parents or expectant parents. And you know, if you put a kid in for a test and they fail, you can blame it on the judge, you can blame it on the ice, you can blame it on the skate, you can blame it on the circumstances, you can blame it on the time of day, you can blame it on, you know, there's a lot of things you can pass it off other than your own incompetence as a coach. If you don't put a test in, really, it's 100% on you as a coach. So I sort of understand why coaches would put in tests that aren't ready, but I don't subscribe to that, and most good coaches I know don't. So if you're around a 3, you're going to have a pass rate of around 40%, 30%. Let's say 30%. Probably a little less, maybe more, I don't know. So the first graph I'm interested in is how do my kids execute the tests. So let's say you have an average skater here. Skater standard. Skater standard. Let's say they have a little bit of execution problems. Let's say they're doing a free skate test and they don't often land the jump. So they have times where they're literally not going to pass the test, and then times when it should definitely pass. So you're tracking their progress. And let's say the progress is something like that, generally below a 3, generally out of the gray zone. To me, that test doesn't go in for sure, even though they had some tests that would clearly, definitely pass. You don't put that test in. There's too much. Right now, the way I drew it, it's less than 50-50 chance they're going to pass that test. So that's one scale I'm thinking of when I put in a test. The other scale I'm thinking of is judging standards. And again, judges have essentially the exact same gray zone. You're going to get what's called a hard judge, and I'm assuming they're a good judge. They're fairly consistent. So let's say they're consistently at a 7, so they expect a little bit more from skaters, a little bit better execution, a little bit better presentation, a little bit better expression, a little bit better power, speed, height. You know, there's a little bit more. They want a little bit more than the other judge, whereas this judge expects very little. If you kind of can barely do the test, get through it on time, on pattern, without looking too Bambi-like ridiculous, clumsy, they're going to pass the test, which is not really what we want. You know, I don't like 5s. Most 5s I see average tests. Average test, a 5 means half the time you're going to pass it, half the time you're going to fail it. You shouldn't be putting kids through that. So I think your average should be around a 7. Now, I'm in the minority in that. Currently I know of only one other coach who really tries to uphold a very high standard out of the 15 or 20 in Halifax. It's only one other one that I know that tries to maintain a high standard and actually executes the high standard. If you listen to them talking, their lip service, they all say they have a high standard. And it's too bad they don't publish pass rates, because a lot of the coaches that brag about how high their standards are for tests have like a 30, 40, 50% pass rate, which is, half the time you're going into a test thinking you're going to fail the test. Not good. Not good for your confidence, not good for your, and it costs money. It costs like $100 every time you take a test. So it's a huge drain on money if you're putting in tests that aren't passing. Anyway, so I'm always looking for a test that's, let's say, and again, kids aren't 100% consistent, but let's say I have a test that's like this. This is kind of the ideal test I'm looking for. I'm looking for a test that might occasionally get bad, but hopefully never gets below a 50-50 thing. It's, I'd say my tests get a little lower. Well, like I said, this is an ideal test for me. This is maybe what 3/4 of my tests are like. So most of the time, easy pass. A very, very, very solid test. And unless I get a judge that is very, very hard, now if I do get a 7 judge who's fairly tough, this kid's going to fail their tests. What, 50% of the time? Looks like they're below that bar 50% of the time. But it's very rare you get a judge like that. If I get a judge that's a 5, I mean, if you look at the 5 line, I'm clearly above their standards for passing the tests. So if I get an average judge on test day, that test should pass every single time, no matter how badly they skate. And that's kind of the ideal that I want. Now, I don't always get that. So first of all, occasionally I get a judge that's a 7 and my pass rate dips, but it hasn't happened in Nova Scotia yet. I haven't seen a particularly hard judge on my kids, on my skaters. But let's say I get a kid that does this, which happens occasionally. Wish I had a different color. I don't know if you can see that line. But I would consider putting in this test for several reasons. It's right around a 4, coming close to the very bottom of the gray area now and then. But, if I get a judge that's a 3, even the worse that test is, it's going to pass. More often than not, you're going to get around a 5 on judging. Might fluctuate. The vast majority of judges are in this range, and they get sparser and sparser as you get further away from that, and they tend to be a little heavier on the easy side than the hard side. If I get a 7, that test is most likely going to fail. So I'm kind of banking on not getting a 7. If I know I'm getting a hard judge in, that test is not going in. But I generally don't assume I'm going to get a hard judge. So I guess I kind of did both my graphs there. The judging standards are, let's assume I get around a 5. The gray area would be where the vast majority, let's say 95% of judges are between a 3 and a 7. So if I'm getting a test that's above or around a 7 most of the time, that's going to pass 90-95% of the time. I mean, it's all a matter of numbers. Anyway, so that's how I deal in. Well, I might as well show some options here. 1, 5, 7. One thing I loved in Labrador is we had a judge that came in once that was, I consider, the perfect standard. She was right around, maybe just under 7. And my standard, as I said, is usually around 7. And that particular test day, all my tests were around 7. I had, I think, 40 tests in, and all 40 of them passed. There's my test standard. There was another judge who has a coach who had the second best standard in Labrador. I won't mention her name, even though she doesn't coach anymore. So she's not really a member of Skate Canada, which means I have no ethical responsibility to portray her well. But I will anyway. She was the second best. She had about a 65% pass rate over the whole year. And she ended up, so her standard usually, she would put tests in that were, maybe a little bit more better than average to pass, which was the second best pass rate in the area. But with this judge, with a 7, actually I can't really say that. She's not really around. I mean, it's going to fluctuate a bit. With this judge that I had 100% pass rate with, she had about a 60% pass rate. The overall pass rate of the test day, I believe, was 61%, and I had the most tests in of any coach. I think there were like 140 tests in or something. I had 40 of them. The other coach had about 15 to 20. And then there was a main coach in another club that had about 35 in, and maybe 30, and a couple other ones. Anyway, a couple of them ended up having like a 5% pass rate on that test day because they tried to sneak away with a bunch of threes and hope they're going to get an easy judge that passes their test, and they didn't. This judge wasn't let anything slip by, which I love, 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 love. Even now on this test day, as I said, it was the most ideal test day I'd ever seen. I had 100% pass rate, 40 tests passed out of 40, and the test day itself, out of 130, 140, 150 tests, had about a 60% pass rate. So what's the math on that? That means about 70 tests failed, none of which were mine. So of the 70 tests that passed, 80 tests that passed, 40 of them were mine, half of them, and the other half were distributed among the other 5 coaches. That to me is an awesome, awesome, awesome test day. Ideal test day. Now, more often than not, the judge isn't going to be quite that hard, and every coach is going to be close to the same standard. But the only time I get really upset is there was one judge that had a standard that was about an 8, and that's not the standard I'm going for. And she failed about, I think I had a 52% pass rate at that test day, and the overall pass rate was 43%. Which again it puts me higher than everyone else, but not impressively higher. My numbers were not good for that test day unless you take everything else into context. You know, it's really hard to sell. Yeah, I had a 55% pass rate, and I was 80% better than the next best coach. It just doesn't work. The numbers don't work that well. I think I explained this all that well, but I think that's better than the other video.